Welcome everybody to the Ruth chapter 4 Bible study. We're going to go ahead and summarize the first few chapters. So Ruth chapter 1 starts out, we learn about this family. And the husband, his name is Elimelech. He has a wife named Naomi, and they have two sons, Mahlon and Kilion. However, there's a famine in the land of Israel and near Bethlehem. And so they decide to essentially flee into the Moabite country. So as they flee over there, they get to Moab. They're there for a while, but some bad things happen and Elimelech dies. So in the context, Naomi has now just lost her very dear husband, and all she's left with are her two sons in this foreign land. And in this foreign land, her two sons go ahead and marry these two Moabite women. They marry Ruth and Orpah. Ruth, of course, is going to be the more important character in this particular story. But they marry these two people, and 10 years go by, but they don't have any children. So it specifically says that they don't have children, that Ruth and Orpah are barren in this whole 10-year period, and that might be looked at as another judgment of God for marrying these foreign women and fleeing the land of Israel just because there's a famine going on. So eventually, though, Mahlon and Kilion die as well, and sadly Naomi is left with these two daughters-in-law, and even though she's been with them for 10 years thus far, they're her daughter-in-laws, and she has lost her biological sons. And finally, they decide to go ahead and travel back to the land of Israel. They hear that maybe there's another harvest coming up. Maybe there's going to be some more food in that area. So as they're traveling over there, Naomi tells her two daughter-in-laws to go back to the land of Moab because they probably won't have much of a future in Israel because they're foreigners. So they probably won't have much of a future. They most likely wouldn't ever be able to find a husband or a decent husband among the Israelites. So she tells them to go back. Orpah decides to go back, but Ruth decides to stay with her mother-in-law. She didn't have to, but she decides to stay and makes this great proclamation of faith and hesed, which is covenant faithfulness, graciousness, love, going out of your way for someone else. Essentially, that's what hesed is, and it's the main theme of the book of Ruth. So Ruth is now displaying this hesed, going out of her way, wanting to follow her mother-in-law here. And she says that your gods will be my gods, specifically when there's only one God of Israel, and your people will be my people. And that amazing proclamation by Ruth there. So they get back to the land of Israel, and things are better there as far as the famine goes, but they're still impoverished, apparently. They're not doing too well for themselves because they've lost the husband who was the main provider of the household, especially back in those ancient days. So there's this basically safety net in the law, you could say, that says the field owners can't harvest from these particular corners and outer areas of their field, and they leave those areas open for any foreigners, any impoverished people, and any widows. And we know that Ruth is both a widow now and a foreigner, and she's also probably impoverished, so she fulfills those three criteria, even though a person only needed to fill at least one of them to glean from fields. So this is the lowest of the low here, pretty much. One of the last things you could do other than selling yourself into indentured servitude. So she's out gleaning from fields, and she just so happens to come upon Boaz's field, who is one of the relatives from Elimelech's side and one of their redeemers as well. Just so happens, which is irony, for this is God's providence, essentially. So she just so happens upon this field, and he takes notice of her and goes ahead and essentially protects her from any of the young men that might want to harm her or touch her or do anything like that. He also says, stay close with the other young women, the servants of the field, be with them, and they'll keep you safe, they'll tell you where to go, so on and so forth. And if you're thirsty, you can go to the containers and drink from where the servants have drawn. That's verse 9. So Boaz takes notice of her. he's protecting her as well. And later on in chapter 2, we see that he's a really nice guy, and he's a really good guy, and he has a good relationship with his servants. He follows the law. He's a good Israelite. He's a good Jew, following the law, things like that. And we notice other things in his character as well, like how he eats with his own servants. He didn't have to. He doesn't have to. He's the landowner. He's the the big cheese essentially in here. But he didn't have to eat with them, but he does. And he's eating with his servants. And then verse 14, he tells Ruth specifically, "Come here and eat from the bread and dip your morsel in the wine vinegar." And in verse 15, "Let her also glean between the sheaves, and do not reproach her, and also pull out for her from your bundles, and leave it so that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So he's being super nice to her. He's eating with her, and specifically telling his own servants to, make it easier for her to glean from the fields and help her along. So we move on then, pretty much to verse 23 of chapter 2. "So she stayed close with the maidservants of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law." So at this point, it seems like there's complacency in the story. It seems like there's a lull or a dip where nothing more is going to happen. And then we move on to chapter 3, where Ruth's mother-in-law essentially tries to make something happen between Boaz and Ruth. Naomi knows that Boaz is a great guy. Maybe Ruth has told her that he seems like a really great guy as well. But apparently nothing is going on, so Naomi tries to forcefully matchmake the two of them, essentially, and she comes up with this scheme. So, get dressed, wash, anoint yourself, and go down to the threshing floor, which is where he's going to be, and he's going to be threshing and things like that with the barley and picking it out and things like that, and then lay at his feet after you uncover his feet. So this crazy scheme here, which could have gone horribly wrong in many different cases, but God's providence pulled through even despite this scheme. And Boaz eventually wakes up, probably because his feet are cold. So he wakes up and he says, verse 9, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your garment over your servant, because you are a redeemer." And we looked at what the context was about redeemers and their thing in the law as well in the previous chapters. But real quickly, the idiom there, spread your garment or spread your wings over your servant, essentially means marry me. So Ruth is saying, marry me, in no uncertain terms. And instead of, calling out this crazy scheme or doing anything like that, we learn that, none of their intentions were that, because Boaz says in verse 10, "You are blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. You did better in this last kindness than the first, by not going after young men, whether poor or rich." So he blesses her and says all these things. And for Schrodinger's question there, I am using the LEB version, the Lexham English Bible, but you are free to use whatever version you want for this particular study. So just so you guys know what version I'm using. So we move on then. So he blesses her for this act of kindness, but then we learn a wrench in the plans, so to speak. The conflict, the next huge problem in the story, is that there is another redeemer who's even closer in line than Boaz. So with this problem, we don't know who Ruth is going to end up marrying. And as far as the story goes, as far as the audience is concerned, we don't want Ruth marrying some random guy that we don't know. We want Ruth marrying Boaz, who we do know, and who we do know more about his character and how good of a person he is, and how he follows the law and things like that, and how he's shown kindness to Ruth. So that's who we want Ruth to end up with, not some random person. We don't really care who the closer redeemer is. We want Ruth to end up with Boaz. And we see Boaz's resolve here. both the duality that's a war going on inside him as a law-abiding Israelite and as someone who wants apparently to marry Ruth. Verse 13 of chapter 3 there, in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, good. But if he is not willing to redeem, then as God lives, I will redeem you. And he uses God's name Yahweh specifically here as well. I will redeem you if he doesn't. So he swears by God's name that if he doesn't redeem you, then Boaz will. And that is the man's resolve here. And we see this sense of urgency as well, though, in the morning. So things have escalated very quickly, all in the course of one night. They're now talking about marriage, but though they have, seen each other before and talked with each other. But things have escalated pretty quickly from where we were in chapter 2. And this urgency is ended with verse 18 there, and we see this huge cliffhanger, which we left off at last week. So Naomi says, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." So we get this urgency, we get this suspense. The reader is forced now to turn the page, and we finally move on to chapter 4, the last chapter in the book of Ruth. We are going to see how things turn out exactly, and if this other redeemer, this random person, will end up with Ruth, or if Boaz is going to end up with Ruth. And we will see what happens in chapter 4. So do we have any volunteers to read for us this chapter 4? And just read the whole thing pretty much.
How do I sound right now?
Pretty good.
Alright. Like, there's no static or not much static?
Not much.
Okay. Then I'll go ahead and read. You said we're using the LEB version?
Yep, but you can use whatever version you want.
Well, it's easier for my brain to comprehend what's going on when I'm in sync.
Gotcha.
So anyways, verse 1. And Boaz had gone up to the city gate and sat there. And look, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken was passing by. And he said, "Come over and sit, friend." I'm saying everything I'm reading. Forgive me if I'm adding too much. And he came over and sat, and he took 10 men from the elders of the city and said, "Sit here." And they sat. And he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who returned from the countryside of Moab, is selling the tract of land which was for our brother how do I say his name?
Just
Elimelech?
Elimelech.
Okay, Elimelech. And I thought I would tell you and say, by it in the presence of those sitting before you, the elders of my people, if you want to redeem it, redeem it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I may know, for there is no one except you to redeem it. And I am after you. And he said, I want to redeem it. And Boaz said, on the day of your acquiring the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead man, in order to raise up for the name of the dead his inheritance. And the Redeemer said, I am not able to redeem for myself, lest I ruin my inheritance. You redeem for yourself my kinsman-redemption, for I am not able to redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the kinsman-redemption and transfer of property. To confirm the matter, a man removed his sandal and gave it to his fellow countryman. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So the Redeemer said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, and he removed his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all of the people, you are witnesses today that I have acquired all that was for Elimelech. I butchered that by accident. I'm sorry. And that was for Kilion the Mahlon, from the hand of Naomi, and also Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon. Sorry, I may have overread. I have acquired as wife to raise up the name of the dead over his inheritance, so that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his relatives, and from the gate of his birthplace you are witness today. And all people who were at the gate of the elders said, "We are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman coming into your house as Rachel and as Leah, and together built the house of Israel. May you have the strength in Ephrathah, and bestow a name in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, and the offspring that Yahweh will give to you from the young woman." So Boaz took Ruth as she became his wife, and he went into her. And Yahweh enabled her to conceive, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be Yahweh, who today did not leave you without redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be for you a restorer of life and a sustainer in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better for you than 7 sons, has borne him." And Naomi took the child, and she put him on her bosom and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they called his name Obed. Forgive me. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. All right. And Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
Wonderful. So keep in mind, just keep it in your heads. If there's anything you want to bring up, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly summarize what we read in chapter 4 there. So from chapter 3, we have this sense of urgency and suspense. We don't know who Ruth is going to end up with. We don't know who this random person is. And we could even take that as a little literary mechanic that the author employs, who doesn't mention the name of this other kinsman redeemer. And either maybe the author just didn't know the name, or maybe the author, well, really the point of it is that we don't know his name, so we can't really connect with that person well either. So we don't know his name, and that is why I've been calling him a random person, because that's how the author wants it to be in our heads. We don't want Ruth ending up with this random person. So Boaz, in the morning, with that urgency, he gathers together all the elders, he sits them down, he brings the other kinsman redeemer in the area, and, the author doesn't mention any greetings or formalities. It goes, sit here, and then Boaz goes straight into business here. Naomi, who returned from the countryside of Moab, is selling a tract of land which was for our brother Elimelech. So he goes straight down into business here. And just some background information, just real briefly here. It was most likely not Naomi selling the land, because once the husband dies, then the land's inheritance, it doesn't go to the wife, it goes to the children, essentially. So Naomi is most likely not selling the land. The word can also mean more of a trade or an authorization of the giving of rights for something. So that's probably what's going on here. This isn't being sold for a price or anything, and Naomi most likely does not have that legal right either to sell the land for money. So that's probably what's happening here according to our commentator, Daniel Block. So it goes on, and verse 4, after telling him what's going on, and he said, the other redeemer, I want to redeem it. So at this point, our hearts kind of drop. We don't know what's going on. It seems like hope has now been lost. But verse 5, Boaz said, on the day of your acquiring the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead man, in order to raise up for the name of the dead his inheritance. So a little more, probably some literary device, probably something that Boaz is employing here. He uses the full name Ruth the Moabite. Now, Daniel Block speculates that this might be intended to kind of discourage the other redeemer from redeeming the land, because Ruth is a Moabite, and we know that Israelites did not look favorably upon marrying foreigners and people like that. And the redeemer might not know that Ruth has pretty much become a proselyte of Israel, has become a proselyte of Judaism, and taken Yahweh as her God. But he says Ruth the Moabite, so he might be phrasing it to kind of discourage him, and in showing his own desire to be Ruth's husband. So pretty interesting stuff here. However, verse 6, and the Redeemer said, I am not able to redeem for myself, lest I ruin my inheritance. And we can take this in a few different ways depending on the law and the culture here. Usually you had to put up some money so you probably would have had to put up some money. For Ruth, he doesn't know this field maybe. It might be a liability monetarily for him as well. So he's going to have to do a lot of investing. And probably most notably is that his own name will kind of pass away, because he's going to be instead propagating the family name of Elimelech instead. So, he might not want to be able to do this. He might not even be able to afford it either. Whatever the case may be, he decides not to go along with this. So he says, you redeem for yourself my kinsman-redemption, for I am not able to redeem it. And at this point, the readers' hearts will be lifted up, and Boaz himself probably has gotten super excited at this point, when his hopes were pretty much dashed right earlier. So then, we get some parenthetical background information from the author. We see in verse 7, in the former times in Israel concerning the kinsman redemption and transfer of property, to confirm the matter, a man removed his sandal and gave it to his fellow countryman. And this is, some weird cultural thing that we might think of, but that's just how they did things back in the day. So that's pretty much chapter 4, at least that first part. They finally get together, and we jump ahead in verse 13 there, pretty much 9 months or so, however long it takes for the pregnancy. And we see in verse 13, Yahweh enabled her to conceive. So this isn't just some natural process. Excuse me. Bit of a tickle in my throat. So this isn't some natural process. Specifically says that God enabled her to conceive. And we learned in chapter 1 that apparently God did not enable them to conceive, because 10 years both Orpah and Ruth were barren. But this is essentially a blessing of this union and an affirmation by God that it is indeed good and is indeed lawful. And Obed is born to Boaz and Ruth, and we finally see really the purpose of Ruth. And it is, again, in our chapter 1 study, the purpose of Ruth was to exalt David by showing the beautiful story of his roots and where he came from, King David. So he came from Boaz and Ruth, and of course, we can skip ahead to Matthew chapter 1 if you want to, And you can see the entire genealogy there. And we go all the way from Jesse fathered David to David fathered yada yada, Jesus Christ, which is very significant and why the book of Ruth is so important. And it's really just a great story. And that's the purpose of Ruth, the genealogy there and exalting David. And of course, the whole theme, and it really fulfills that purpose by the theme, which is to display Hesed, which is covenant faithfulness, grace, mercy, love, going out of your way for someone else. And we see that in Ruth, we see that in Boaz, and that is why it's such a beautiful story and why it exalts David, because he has these great grandparents. So that is chapter 4. Do we have any thoughts that you guys want to bring up throughout the chapter? You can point out anything that you want to bring up to the group, anything that you thought was interesting or that you have questions on.
I was just going to say, so my understanding of why the first Redeemer in line was like, oh, no thanks, once he found out that Ruth came with the deal, is because any child that children that he would have had by Ruth, and I don't know if you mentioned it, sorry if I missed it, but any children that he would have had by Ruth would have, he would have had to share inheritance with them, and he likely already had children otherwise. So that's one conjecture on why he was like, no thanks, once he found out that Ruth was part of it.
Yeah, that is a good point. I actually didn't mention that specifically, but it is mentioned by Block as well as one of the possibilities of why he had to turn it down. Because yeah, just like you said, he would have probably had to split his own inheritance with this firstborn of Elimelech's family. And, it was a sticky situation there. We don't know how exactly it would play out if he did have his children of himself, but we do know that there were difficulties there, and he might not want to have split his inheritance or given his inheritance or lost his own family name for Elimelech's. Any other ideas or thoughts that you had about the passage?
I just love it because it's a beautiful story of redemption, and as is mentioned in my study Bible, it starts out with Naomi's husband and 2 sons die, but then at the end there's redemption and God blesses her with a family through Ruth because of Ruth's, awesome loyalty that she had. So it's just a neat story to see like the full picture of how God worked in their lives, and then of course how the line of David was through them. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. I just want to note as well along those lines the kind of secondary theme of emptiness and fullness. So in chapter 1, we hear that Naomi goes away, and she herself specifically says, I went away empty, or I went away full. So she had Elimelech and her 2 sons, but then she came back to Israel empty. And, just like you said, later on, now we see that Naomi has gotten a family through Ruth, and, the women and people specifically say that Ruth is better than 7 sons. This loyal daughter is better than 7 whole sons. And before she had 2 sons, and they weren't very loyal, it seems, because they married Moabite women, and we know from the law that is not something the Israelites should do. But they go ahead and did that, and we see that it was most likely, again, not according to the law, and it was not a union blessed by God because they were barren for 10 whole years. And, the text specifically mentions that, and it mentions the hand of God. And all of that is in contrast now to Boaz and Ruth's union, whom God blesses. So any other thoughts on the passage that we just went through? Yeah, there's no pressure to speak or anything, but that's pretty much chapter 4 then. I guess last call for any thoughts before we wrap things up. All right, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. We'll go ahead and finally, since this is the last chapter, I'll just summarize everything real quickly here. So chapter 1, again, we start out with Elimelech, 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion, and the mother and the wife, Naomi. They flee from a famine. They move into the land of Moab. Elimelech dies. Mahlon and Kilion die. Naomi is left with 2 daughter-in-laws. Orpah returns to Moab. Ruth comes with her mother-in-law to Israel, and there she happens upon a field of Boaz, and she gleans there for a while, and he takes notice of her. He protects her. He provides for her. He gives her food. He's really nice to her. And we see this great relationship developing, but it doesn't seem like things are going to get further until Naomi devises this scheme to matchmake Boaz and Ruth, and apparently it works to some degree. But we then learn that there is another redeemer, a closer redeemer line than Boaz. So this is a lot of suspense. This is a lot of even urgency and uncertainty here as well. So finally, chapter 3 ends on this great cliffhanger. We don't know how things are going to end up. We don't know who Ruth is going to marry. But then chapter 4 starts in, and Boaz, true to his word and his resolution, he immediately sits down the elders, sits down the other redeemer. He talks them through what's going to happen, and he lays out the plan and the things going on. And the other redeemer first says yes, but then he says no. And it is then up to Boaz to redeem the field, and more importantly, to redeem Ruth and as well as Elimelech's dying family line. And that is pretty much where the story ends. And we learn that they have a child named Obed. And for the entire purpose of the author here, the main purpose, he goes in with the genealogy and ends with that. Verse 22, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Of course, King David, whom, unbeknownst most likely to the author, we see later on in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, very first chapter, we see this same genealogical line being traced down to Jesus Christ. So super important with great relevance to the New Testament. And that is the book of Ruth. So I guess we'll go ahead and do the ending prayer here. And, think about it if you want to volunteer for that. And then after the ending prayer, we will go ahead and do a vote for the next excursion into the Bible, our next series. So does anyone want to volunteer for us to close us out with a word of prayer? All right, I'll go ahead and pray then. Let's bow our heads in reverence. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this wonderful day that you've given us and this time that you've given us to gather together in your name and study your word, and finally finish the book of Ruth, getting to the most amazing part, which is the genealogy, really, and how we can trace that all the way down to Jesus Christ in the time of the New Testament. Thank you for going through all of that and having your guiding hand and your providential hand throughout all of that, you and your sovereignty, Lord, going through all of this craziness and amazing providence and sovereignty here. How Ruth just so happens upon Boaz's field, how they get together, how even through the difficulties and problems of learning of this other Redeemer, that your plan still held true, and that children were still born into this genealogical line because you preserved that line. It did not have to go that way. Boaz did not have to marry Ruth, and the kinsman-redeemer probably didn't have to marry Ruth either. And so that genealogical line could have easily died out, especially due to the famine and the time of the judges, but you did not let it die out, Lord. You, in your providence, got through that, got us through that, and were able to bring Jesus Christ down through this genealogical line. And I thank you for all of that, Lord. I finally pray that we'll be able to remember all of this great stuff and tie it into the New Testament as well with even more importance, but not to forget the great importance of Ruth and Boaz themselves. I pray that we'll all have a good day for the rest, and in Jesus' name, amen.
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 All right, well, I think some votes are already going ahead, but I do have some books in mind already. I do want to, again, do a shorter one because Romans was pretty intense. So I have some options for us, and Revelation is too long, too long to do, at least at this point. So I guess the first option is a minor prophet. I kind of want to stay away from Paul for a bit because Romans was pretty long. I want to give us a balanced biblical diet, so to speak. So the option number one is doing a minor prophet, which would be like Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, Hosea, people like that. And number two is John's short letters. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Number three would be Peter's letters, 1st, 2nd Peter. And the fourth option is we could do some gospel snippets, or even the book of Mark. It's about 16 chapters, I think. So those are the options there. You guys can go ahead and vote on those. I chose them because they are short and they're not Paul. We spent 15, 16 weeks on Paul already. All right, so we have two votes for number one, and we have a vote for number 2 or 3 so far. Okay, we have 3 votes for number 2 now, so that is now in the lead. 2 votes for number 1, 3 votes for number 2. All right, looks like most people are going with number 2 now. I already counted your vote in hat. Okay, it looks like pretty much the majority has picked number 2 then. So for next week, we are going to be in John's short letters. So his first letter has a few chapters, and the next couple ones are even shorter. I think 3rd John has only 1 chapter. So we'll be in John's short letters, and thank you all for just a wonderful Bible study. Thank you for being here, and I'll probably maybe stick around for a few more minutes if anyone wants to talk. Just kind of hang out for a bit.